इस नवंबर आपके पसंदीदा वक्ता और यूट्यूबर्स मिलेंगे एक ही जगह, जयपुर डायलॉग्स एनुअल समिट 2025 में 7, 8 और 9 नवंबर। जी हाँ, राष्ट्रवादियों का महाकुंभ इस साल वापस आ रहा है। आज ही रजिस्टर करें। आप मिल सकते हैं गौरव आर्य, राजीव नारायणन, आदि अचिंत, अजय रैना, मीनाक्षी जैन, एक्स मुस्लिम साहिल, तहसीन पूनावाला, कंचन गुप्ता और 100 से अधिक वक्ता से। और यदि आप इस कार्यक्रम में आने में असमर्थ हैं तो आप इस कार्यक्रम में सहयोग दे सकते हैं। आपकी मदद से 40% धनराशि पूर्ण हो चुकी है। इस कार्यक्रम को आपके फाइनेंशियल सपोर्ट की आवश्यकता है और आपके सहयोग से ही एक हिंदू इकोसिस्टम बनेगा और एक सफल कार्यक्रम होगा। रजिस्ट्रेशन के लिए और डोनेट करने के लिए नीचे लिंक दिए हुए हैं और आप सपोर्ट के लिए स्क्रीन पर दिया QR भी स्कैन कर सकते हैं। Namaste. Welcome to all of you, and we have a very, very exciting guest today, and that's Salvatore Babones, straight from Sydney.
Pleasure to talk to you.
So welcome. And he's written a very new, exciting book as well, which we are going to talk about. And that's Dharma Democracy.
You can say it better than I can.
And in the Indian flag's livery, as you can see. Can you hold it up once again, please?
Yes, of course.
Here. So this is the Indian flag, as you can see.
Now, don't blame me if you're upset. Publishers decide book covers, and I said, is it respectful to have the country's flag as the cover of the book? And the publisher said, no, it'll be fine. And I said, I'm not sure. I said, maybe it's, seems a little disrespectful to claim the flag, but the publisher wanted it.
And the subtitle is How India Built the Third World's First Democracy. Now, that's interesting. Third World's First Democracy. Is it really in time the third world's first democracy?
Well, it's first in two senses. It's first in the sense that India led the wave of decolonization after World War II and led the world into democracy. India's democracy predates the democracies of all of the new countries that were born after World War II. But I would also say India is the third world's highest quality democracy, that it's first in quality. And I think both are entirely defensible. In fact, India's democracy is one of the oldest, longest lasting democracies in the world. It's very hard to find a country that has been democratic for more than about 25 or 30 years. So there was a big wave of democratization after the fall of the Soviet Union. So let's say, more than 30 years of democracy are hard to find anywhere. Never mind to find them in countries that have a GDP per capita of less than about $20,000. There, it's almost impossible to find a democracy that's been around for 30 years. So yes, both in the sense of first in time, but also first in quality. Now, a lot of people have objected to third world, and to those people, I say wear it as a term of respect and a term of pride. India was the leader of the third world. The third world simply means there was a first world, which was the United States and Western Europe, a second world that was the Soviet bloc, and India led the non-aligned movement, that third world. And it is something to be proud of for Indians, that India has been historically the leader of the third world, as opposed to thinking of third world in some negative way as being associated with poverty. So I think in all senses, the subtitle of the book accurately captures India's reality as the third world's first and foremost democracy.
Of course, Donald Trump doesn't seem to think so. He thinks that all the problems are created by India.
Well, Donald Trump is... So Donald Trump is treating India, and again, you may not see it this way, but treating India with respect as being as important and as tough a negotiating partner as dealing with the European Union. That is, Donald Trump is not treating India like he would most other countries that have a GDP per capita of $2,500. He's not treating India like a sub-Saharan African country and saying, well, you have a small, poor economy, we're not going to worry about it. He's negotiating with India on the same terms that he negotiates with the European Union. And that may be very unpleasant for many Indians, and I'm not saying that his policies are right. I'm not endorsing the policies.
No, that's a different subject altogether.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that it's no
altogether.
disrespect
Let's
to India
let's
as a
not go
country or as
too
a
much into
democracy.
it. Let's stick to the book and the title, the Dharma Democracy. Now, dharma has many connotations,
Of course.
as you have yourself explored in the introduction that you have written. So would you like to explain to the people here, the audience, how you structure your concept of dharma? Because dharma can be spiritual, can be political, can be social, it can be familial.
Let me say at the outset, I am not a theologian and I am not a Sanskrit scholar. I'm using dharma simply in the sense of duty. Dharma means duty. But dharma is a specifically Hindu word for duty. It is not a Christian word for duty, a Latin word for duty, a Greek word for duty. It is specifically Hindu and Indian word for duty. And thus, dharma for me plays two purposes in the title. One is it communicates that I'm talking about India being a democracy of duties, where the rhetoric is based on duty. The rhetoric is not based on rights. And during the Indian independence movement, there was a big debate about this with people like Sri Aurobindo and Mahatma Gandhi talking about the importance of duty in India and in Asia more broadly, as opposed to rights as being the foundation on which a democracy should be based. But I'm also using the title Dharma Democracy because the fundamental thesis of the book is that India has succeeded as a democracy because of the strength of Hindu civil society in India. And that Western political scientists have not understood Indian democracy because for a Western political scientist, by definition, if something is religious, it is not civil society. And so Western political scientists have said, how can India survive as a democracy? It has no civil society. And they've not recognized that India does have a civil society. It's just that it's deeply religious, as opposed to being a secular civil society, as we had in the emergence of democracy in the United States and in Western Europe.
There's also a lot of contradiction between the terms secular and, as we understand, dharma. I have a lot of arguments with our Muslim friends.
Sure.
That if you make it a Hindu Rashtra, if you make India a Hindu Rashtra, then what will happen to the minorities? Then I have to tell them that, look, there is no concept of othering in the Hindu religion. There is no zimmi, there's a concept of zimmi, the second-class citizen in Islam. And I tell them that, look, if Pakistan is an Islamic republic, then the minorities, all non-Muslims there are zimmis. They're supposed to pay jizya according to the Sharia law. But in a Hindu situation, there is no difference. And all the political, if you look at even the greatest empires of the ancient era, they say that Dharma Danda is above Rajdanda. Okay, Rajdanda is the state, and Dharma Danda is the guru. So you cannot divorce Dharma from Rajya. That is what you'll probably find if you go through the Bhagavad Gita as well. So this concept of secularism, separation of church and state, doesn't really apply to India. That's what I think, because the separation here was at many levels. If you read Arthashastra of Chanakya, I don't know whether you have, they place so many checks and balances that somebody who is dedicated to the study of knowledge, he cannot gather wealth, he cannot gather riches, and he cannot aspire for power. Then one who is invested with power, he has to remain under the knowledgeable, and he cannot gather riches. So in fact, not just a binary of church and state, there are multi-level restrictions which apply there, and that is the larger dharma. So dharma by itself is it's beyond secular.
So once again, the language of Western political science cannot be applied to India without some reconsideration. So you yourself use the term separation of church and state, but there's no church in the Hindu faith. And so separation of church and state was necessary in the West because churches were authoritative structures. If you're a member of the Presbyterian Church, you can't be a member of the Methodist Church. If you're a member of the Methodist Church, you can't be a member of the Catholic Church. Right? These are authoritative structures with a book with a specific set of criteria for membership that precludes you from membership in other churches. In India, of course, in the Hindu faith, there's no such exclusivity among other among groups of Hindu worshippers, or even, for that matter, between Hindu worshippers for the most part, and even if you wanted to be Christian, which is to say, if a Christian wants to go into a Hindu temple and offer puja, that there's no problem with that. But of course, if a Hindu wants to go into a Christian church and take communion, no, that's prohibited. Right? So the very structure of Hindu faith is very different from the structure of Christian worship. And the whole idea of the separation of church and state really makes much more sense in a Western context. That said, and unequivocally in India, the current Indian state is an absolutely secular state. The difference is that the Indian nation is fundamentally a Hindu nation, right? And there's a difference between one's duty to the state and one's duty to the nation. In India, the nation, as a Hindu nation, has created a sense of belonging, a sense of wholeness in India that, while not excluding Muslims in any explicit sense, has led to Muslim separation within India. That is, many Muslims in India don't feel very connected to a Hindu suffused Indian nation. That said, they're very much citizens of the Indian state, and there's no barrier to them being citizens of the Indian state. So the existence of a strong Hindu nation in India has at the same time supported Indian democracy from below, making it strong. It's made the Indian state strong. But it has led to a social exclusion, not a civil exclusion, not a political exclusion, a social exclusion of Muslim Indians who are not participating fully in Indian social life. It's both been the strength and the fundamental challenge of Indian democracy, which is finding a role in Indian democracy for Muslim Indians. That's still a challenge today. And many Muslim Indians have not found a way to fully participate in national life. They've not endorsed full participation in national life in India, despite having full civil rights. Right? So it's both the strength of Indian democracy and the challenge of Indian democracy.
The pre-partition politics still continues in many ways.
Well, so I have a whole chapter on partition because this book is written for a Western audience, and Westerners don't understand the challenge of partition, which is that Pakistan was created because Muslim intellectual leaders insisted that Muslims could not live as a minority under Hindu or any rule, Hindu, Christian, any other rule. Yet, of course, no matter what formula you had for the creation of Pakistan, or Bangladesh as it later became in East Pakistan, there were going to be Muslims continuing to live in a Hindu majority nation. And so partition never made any theoretical sense. But when the rhetoric existed that there were two nations in India, and Muslim intellectuals almost to a person, I mean, 95% of Muslim intellectuals in the 1930s and 40s endorsed this view that Muslims were a separate nation in India. Well, what role does that leave Muslims in India to play in the national life? It's a very challenging idea. I mean, once you create a homeland for India's Muslims, what do you do? What does it mean for Muslims who don't go to that homeland?
Dr. Ambedkar had recommended
Yes.
and advocated complete exchange of population. That did not happen. Only 7.2 million Muslims out of the 3.5, out of the 35 million that were there in the Indian part, in the Indian dominion, let's say, only 7.2
small
million
number. It's a
went
very
away.
small number. However, nearly every member of the Muslim intellectual
And one
class.
second, and almost all of them were from Punjab, some parts of UP,
Yeah.
and that's about
And
all.
Bengal.
No, and some from, yes, Bihar
Yeah.
and Bengal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the rest of India, which had voted 100% for the Muslim League,
Yes.
nobody went.
Except the intellectuals. And that's something that's understood a little bit inside India. It's completely misunderstood outside India. And I have the documentation in the book. Nearly all Muslim intellectuals left India to join Pakistan. And by intellectuals, I mean people like, not only people like university professors, but high military officers, members of the Indian civil service. They had the option. Muslim members of the Indian civil service could opt for India or Pakistan. And I think it's over 98% of them opted for Pakistan, even when they themselves were from parts of India that remained inside India. So a Kerala Muslim civil service officer or Uttar Pradesh Muslim civil service, they chose to relocate and move to Pakistan. In the Indian Express, if you read the advertisements in the Indian Express from 1948 through 1955 or so, you'll see ads by highly educated Muslims saying, seeking a position in Pakistan. And it's funny, they're advertising not in Dawn, they're advertising in the Indian Express saying, I'm sorry, not the Indian, Times of India. They're advertising in the Time of India saying, I'd like to move to Pakistan to take a job there. Okay. The result is that even though millions of Muslims remained in India, nearly all of the Muslim non-religious leadership left to go to Pakistan, with the result that Muslims remaining in India had as leadership for their community, for the most part, only mullahs and other religious leaders. They didn't have that whole stratum of Muslim civilian intellectuals, civil intellectuals who were not part of the religious establishment. That whole stratum left and went to Pakistan. And so when we ask questions like, why are there so few Muslims in the officers in the Indian military today? Why are there so few Muslim Indian administrative service officers? Why are there so few Muslims at the highest levels of corporations and at the highest levels of universities? The answer is that their ancestors left for Pakistan.
Yes, most of the intellectual elites, as we call them, there's a term in Urdu, and they are called Ashraf, and the plural is Ashraf. So almost all the Ashraf left for Pakistan.
But this also explains a lot. For example, why do Muslims in India tend to vote as a voting bloc? Now, the standard answer is they're trying to protect themselves against Hindus. I don't think there's much credibility to that. But I think they're voting as a voting bloc because the ordinary stratum of local intellectuals who would help broker relations between the state and society, that stratum of intellectuals, which still exists for Hindu Indians, who are trying to negotiate for people among who are we going to vote for, who is our community going to support, that stratum is gone. And the role that would be played by that stratum is instead played by the mosque. Right? So it's the mosque that's influencing Muslim voting patterns, not members of Muslim civil society. And so the creation of Pakistan during partition and the logic of partition created the situation that results in the social exclusion of Muslim Indians today. Now, it's something that can't go on forever, right? I mean, however people may feel, and I know there's a lot of controversy about this, the fact is Muslim Indians are Indians. They're going to remain Indians. The question is, how can Muslim Indians best be integrated into the mainstream of Indian society? And that's the fundamental challenge. And again, there's a chapter in the book about ways to address that fundamental challenge. But that's the biggest remaining challenge of Indian democracy is 14 to 15% of the population, 200 million people are poorly integrated into the Indian nation, despite having full rights as citizens of the Indian state.
Many would say, in spite of having more privileges than Hindus, there is in fact there's
In
a
many ways, yes.
grievance. There's a very, very large grievance among Hindus that they don't quite have as much right as the minorities have.
Well, and I wouldn't even frame it as a grievance. I mean, I know for many people it is a grievance, but in many ways it's also a problem for Muslim Indians. So take, for example, the Muslim family laws. The lack of a uniform civil code in India makes Muslims, like some Hindus characterize it as, well, it makes Muslims more privileged citizens. I would put it differently. It makes Muslims second-class citizens. It says that if you're born a Muslim in India, you don't enjoy the full protection of the Indian constitution and Indian law. You are also subject to your own religious authorities. Well, that makes you to some degree a second-class citizen in India. I mean, the idea of uniform civil code and civil code reform is generally portrayed as, if you want a uniform civil code, you're somehow anti-Muslim. But clearly, I mean, I think if you look at this dispassionately, if you ignore what individual people are saying about it, what intellectuals are saying about it, if you ignore what imams are saying about it, and you just ask logically, what would be the most progressive thing for Muslim Indians as citizens of India to have full participation in India? They should be subject to the same laws as all other Indians and subject to the same protections of the law that all other Indians enjoy. Right? So is it a special thing for Muslims, or is it something that Muslims have been left out of the Indian mainstream? I rather suspect the latter.
That takes it back to the same problem that you raised, that there's hardly any elite class left. And
yes.
So this kind of a prescription is a threat to those who actually decide the fate of the Muslims. The mullah class is absolutely totally anti, because mullah class derives a lot of power through the Sharia law.
Yes.
In fact, there's a very interesting situation here. If you look at that, in 1937, the Shariat Application Act was brought in India. And in the Shariat Application Act, there are Section 2, there's a Section 3. It's a very small act. So I think it's Section 2. And so in the Section 2, what they say that, okay, everything would be decided as far as the women are concerned. Everything would be decided as per the Sharia law, and all lands except agricultural lands. So who owned the agricultural lands? The Nawabs, the elites, the zamindars. They put agricultural land out of that. Not only that, in Section 3, they say that anything relating to wills, to legacies, and to intestacies, everything connected to that would be applicable only if a Muslim opts for it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see the twist.
But I view this so. But for ordinary,
the application was only to women and the poor.
Okay.
All the elites, the Nawabs, the zamindars, the landed gentry, they saved their land. They did not have to apportion their land according to the Sharia law. The best example is Nawab of Bhopal.
Right. But for ordinary Muslims, these special laws represent a problem that gives them a second-class citizenship. These aren't advantages for the ordinary Muslims. And I think that's something that, with the lack of an intellectual class to organize Muslim opinion, these issues have not become politicized within the Muslim Indian community. And that's a real challenge for the Muslim Indian community. I mean, I said earlier that Hindu civil society in India was horizontally organized. It didn't fall into silos like Western churches. It was organized in ways that created connections among people within the community. Of course, Muslim civil society is entirely different. It's organized the same way as Christian civil society. That is, it's organized in silos. You go to one mosque, or you go to the other mosque, or you go to the other mosque. If you're a Shia, you don't go to the Sunni mosque. If you're a Sunni, you don't go to the Sufi celebration, right? You're in separate silos with
Sunnis can be Sufis also.
But the traditional Sufi authorities.
Exactly, the difference is Barelvi and Deobandi.
Yeah, the traditional Sufi authorities
Barelvis
are
are largely
very,
Sufis.
Yeah. Okay. And so this creation of vertical silos prevents people from making connections among each other. And that's why, again, I go back to the Muslim vote in India, primarily being driven in vote blocks, that an entire vote block of people who are followers of one religious authority will vote as a group, is very different from how people vote on the Hindu side. So I often hear it said, the BJP is a Hindu party in India. And I always point out to people, Hindus make up 80% of the population of India. The BJP gets 33% of the vote. So there are many Hindu parties in India, right? It's the BJP has no monopoly.
They got last time 36.
Has no monopoly. And the BJP has to compete with other parties in the public arena in order to attract Hindu voters. It doesn't simply get the Hindu vote. Okay, because Hindus have a complex civil society that is not put into silos where people vote as a block. Now, I know there's some exceptions to that. There are caste-based voting blocks in India. There are some geographical and linguistic-based voting blocks in India. But for the most part, Hindus who vote in India are choosing among multiple options of who to vote for, which creates a very healthy democracy in India. And again, I go back to that the double meaning of Dharma Democracy. Dharma Democracy meaning that India is fundamentally a Hindu democracy, as well as being a democracy of duty.
Right.
Now, every country has to be based on duty. The issue is the rhetoric. And in India, the rhetoric of duty is at the forefront of duty to the country and duty to the nation. That's something that you find even among Muslim Indians. So we have good survey data on this, that although the impression I often see online is that Muslim Indians are somehow not fully Indian or not fully committed to India, or somehow a fifth column for Pakistan. Just look at the Pahalgam attacks. After the Pahalgam attacks, Pakistan fully expected that there would be Hindu-Muslim rioting in India, with Muslims taking the side of Pakistan. That didn't happen. There were 2 or 3 news stories of a few people having some, confrontation, mostly students in a couple places. Muslim Indians overwhelmingly embraced their Indian identity. They didn't root for Pakistan after the Pahalgam attacks. And in fact, we have very good survey data on this, that Muslim Indians overwhelmingly feel patriotic as Indians. They don't want to live anywhere else. There is essentially no Muslim outmigration from India. There's no sense in which Muslim Indians are not citizens of the Indian state. The problem is full participation in the processes of Indian society is missing. That's a legacy of partition. And Indians, you and your fellow countrymen, have to find some way ultimately to address that. Otherwise, the problem will fester forever.
The political leaders of the Muslims, they look for these opportunities. You might have noticed or observed the debate around the Waqf Act.
Yes.
When we say that there are privileges to Muslims, the Waqf Act was one such act. Tremendous privileges. Anything that the Waqf board laid its hand on, it could just claim for itself, and then the onus was on the other person whose land was claimed.
So once again, I think it's a very good example.
A lot of bad blood about it. I myself prosecuted a public interest litigation against that act.
Okay. So once again, the Waqf administration, the rules for Waqf administration and regulation favor a small class of elite Muslims.
Yes, that is there. The backward Muslims they were not affected.
Does it benefit the Muslim community as a whole? I think very little, if at all, right? And so a more transparent governance, and I wrote about this, about the Waqf Act. I said, well, I'm not convinced that requiring a more transparent governance of Waqf properties is anti-Muslim. In fact, requiring a more transparent and accountable governance of Waqf properties is pro-Muslim. Now, elite Muslims will cry bloody murder that you're taking away their control, their informal and poorly oversighted control of Waqf properties. But it's to the benefit of the Muslim community if Waqf properties are properly overseen. And we see the same thing in other countries. So for example, in Australia, there's a serious problem of governance of indigenous land. Why? Because people are too nervous. They don't want to challenge any indigenous authority over indigenous land rights, which means that ordinary indigenous people are often losing out on the benefits of indigenous land rights because a small number of indigenous intellectuals control the debate and have very little oversight around this. Contrast that with the United States, where indigenous land is governed by very transparent organizations. Tribal governments are democratically elected. Tribal governments are accountable to their members. Tribal governments have to produce financial reports every year. They have to get audited. They're subject to state supervision. And so tribal land in the US is administered for the benefit of ordinary Native Americans, to the extent that if Native Americans are lucky enough to sit on oil or to be close enough to a city, and people have probably heard of the Indian casinos in the United States, the entire tribe gets wealthy because of the transparent and well-regulated governance. So in the Waqf debate in India, I would be a strong proponent that Waqf governance should be transparently administered with the best administrators. Yes, the people who are controlling the Waqf property should largely be Muslim, but do the accountants have to be Muslim? Get the best accountants you can get. Should the auditor be Muslim? Get the best auditor money can buy. Should their lawyer be Muslim? No, get the best lawyer money.
They've cornered so many lands of other communities.
Because fundamentally, the whole point of the Waqf property is that it should be run for the benefit of the community, not for the benefit of the people who run the Waqf property.
Shall we move to some other chapters that you've written? Let's start with your first chapter, which says India and electoral autocracy.
Electoral autocracy, yeah. That's the stats-heavy chapter. I moved it to the front. It was originally farther back in the book. And
because you've done a lot of work on various indices.
Look, the indices are ridiculous. Look, Sanjeev Sanyal has done some really good work on this, and he's pointed out some really visible problems with the indices. So, for example, none of the indices of democracy ask, is the head of state elected instead of hereditary? They all accept, well, if you have a hereditary head of state, like the King of England or the King of Sweden, that's all right. That's not anti-democratic. No, it's ridiculous. It's clearly anti-democratic to have a hereditary head of state who must be of a certain religion. Okay, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Denmark, these are far, in terms of their head of state and in terms of their state religion, they're much less secular than India. They're much less democratic than India. Now, so Sanyal's criticisms are perfectly good, but they don't go near deep enough. The problems with the international rankings go much, much deeper than just headline grabbing things like, is there a state religion? If you start unpacking the rankings and get into the statistics, you get these strange facts. Like, for example, China and Vietnam. Well, let me use Vietnam as an example. Vietnam's a great case. The Varieties of Democracy Institute has 5 major domains of democracy. They are officials elected? Is the vote universal suffrage? Are the elections clean, free and fair elections? Can people organize freely? So, is there freedom of organization? and is there freedom of expression? Those are the 5. Now, if you look at Vietnam, they say, well, Vietnam, the constitution says that all officials are elected. Perfect score. And they say, look at Vietnam, is universal suffrage in Vietnam? Perfect score. And they look at the elections in Vietnam and they say, are they run in a clean way? That is, is there no violence at the polls? Is there no vote buying? Is everything done transparently in the election? They say, perfect score. Well, wait a minute. Vietnam's a Communist Party dictatorship.
There's only one party there.
And so the only place where you get Vietnam is when you finally if you get freedom of association, well, then there's a question, are you able to form opposition parties? In Vietnam gets a 0. But it's only getting a 0 on one aspect of one of the 5 dimensions of democracy. Substantively, of course, that's ridiculous. Vietnam, yes, it has elections, but only one party is allowed to register. Yes, you can vote, but you can only vote for one person. Yes, the elections are well run, but they're well run because nobody cares about the election. Like, why is there violence at the polls in India? Because it really matters who gets into office. Right? I mean, that's fundamentally why there's violence. There's violence because, if the other party gets elected, me and my family are being turned out of the official bungalow, and we're going to have to find a new way to support ourselves because we lost the election. Okay? So there's violence at the polls now. So the irony is that the very things that are a sign of
even that has come down.
Come down dramatically. Yeah, in the last 25 years.
I have worked as an observer for the Election Commission of India in about a dozen elections.
Oh, really?
But and I have worked as the district election officer, and I have worked as the returning officer. So about 20 odd times where I've been involved in the elections directly.
Oh, wow.
And I can tell you from personal experience, because the most violent state that used to be was Bihar.
Right.
And I've done elections there. I've been there observer twice. And I was there in 1999. There was a hell of a lot of bad violence, I must tell you.
Right.
And then I was there observer again in 2010. There was no violence at all.
Right.
And the situation continues. So what used to happen in the 80s and 90s,
right,
those incidences are now minimal.
So ironically,
except for a couple of states which are notable exceptions.
So ironically, in the Rise of Democracy Institute rankings, if you go to their historical rankings, they consider Indian democracy to have reached its highest quality ever in 1998 to 2000. The period of fractured government with relatively high levels of violence
and corruption,
with high levels of corruption, but because of the way they measure democracy, none of this gets captured, or very little of it gets captured in their indices. So there are serious statistical problems with the VDEM rankings and with the other democracy rankings. Now, one of the most serious problems is,
for instance, I believe that the Freedom House ranks press freedom in Afghanistan higher than India.
Yeah, these stats are almost amusing to make fun of. For a while,
maybe because there are no newspapers there, so perfect ranking.
Yeah. Well, so this gets to the fundamental reason, which is, and this is the one thing that if anyone knows me in India, this is what they know me for. It's India's intellectuals who are anti-India. Now, I didn't say that in order to stigmatize Indian intellectuals. I said that to explain to Indians that it's not Sweden that's ranking India on the Rise of Democracy Institute rankings. It's Indians who are ranking India on the Rise of Democracy Institute rankings, which means that Sweden sends out a survey to a bunch of Indian and a bunch of Afghan and a bunch of Iranian and a bunch of Pakistani political scientists and journalists. And it asks them, is journalism free in your country? Well, if you're still alive as a journalist in Afghanistan today, you must be on the side of the government, right? So there's this fundamental problem that the survey is set up to be conducted in a country that's free, open, and fair, where people don't live in fear. When you apply that in a non-democratic setting, like Pakistan, like Afghanistan, like Bangladesh, you get results perverse results that don't reflect reality. Okay. On the other hand, in India, you have to ask yourself, who's being surveyed? I mean, who is likely to be, if you think, what journalist is likely to be surveyed by Variety Democracy Institute or by Reporters Sans Frontières, the Reporters Without Borders? Well, the main English language media stars, let's take one that everybody knows. Is Arnab Goswami being surveyed by the Varieties of Democracy Institute for his opinion on press freedom? Absolutely not. Right? They're going to people. They're going to people they consider independent journalists who run niche websites. Forget Arnab. Are they going to Hindi language publications, to Kannada language, to Telugu language publications? No. They're going to international journalists who speak at international conferences. That's the journalist who gets in the Varieties of Democracy Institute ranking. Same thing for political scientists. Who are they asking to evaluate Indian democracy? They're asking political scientists from India who speak at international conferences and publish in international journals and have international connections. In other words, they're asking their friends. Now, if you're
who are predominantly leftists,
who are predominantly on the left side of politics in India, and that creates this inherent bias in the rankings, because so I show this in the book. I show this in detail by examining particular cases. So, for example, freedom of expression in India is rated now very low. It's rated as low as during the emergency. Okay, I think that's ridiculous. Let's leave that aside for a minute. In 1951, Nehru pushed through the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution that took away the absolute freedom of the press that Ambedkar had inserted. Ambedkar had got his law degree at Columbia University in the United States. And he ensured that the Indian Constitution included the US First Amendment protections of absolute freedom of speech and absolute freedom of the press. What did Nehru do in his First Amendment? Before even holding an election, before India's first election, he put through the First Amendment limiting freedom of the press and freedom of speech. I put in the book quotes from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Times of India from 1951, all of them saying this is the end of freedom of press in India. And I think it was the Washington Post that said, in India today, after Nehru's First Amendment, freedom of the press is worse than under British colonialism. And yet, when I check the VDEM rankings for 1951, it doesn't go down. It's perfect freedom of the press until you get to the emergency, which means the experts, who are for the most part Nehruvians, the experts, well, they accept. I mean, the emergency is so egregious that how can you not accept that freedom of the press was restricted during the emergency? But when Nehru did it, it's as if it never happened. Right? So we have very strong evidence. And again, whatever you think of Nehru, whatever you think I'm not arguing, should freedom of the press on a scale from 0 to 4, should it be a 3? Should it be a 2? Should it be a 2.8? I don't know the answer to that. As a quantitative social scientist, I don't know the answer. However, I do know that when someone pushes through a constitutional amendment to reduce press freedom, and when major newspapers in India and in the United States all condemn this move, certainly there should be some dip in the line, but there isn't any dip. It's as if it never happened in the data. And it's not, that's just one example. So, and the book is full of examples. There's a whole chapter of examples on these issues with democracy. And then later in the book, there's a whole chapter in the book about accusations that India is anti-Muslim. And again, going to the data and, is there any data to support this? And there's no data to support the idea that India is anti-Muslim. Individual Indians, I want to be clear for people, individual Indians may be Islamophobic, and individual Indians may be anti-Hindu. Right. I mean, but the question is there any evidence that there's systematic repression of Muslims? Zero. Right. It's just not there. And these are both data-driven chapters of the book.
Okay. Why have you included a chapter specifically on Yogi Adityanath?
The Yogi. So remember, this is a book for Western audiences, and the chapter on the Yogi was meant to be the first chapter. Actually, until 1 month before the book was finalized for publication, the first chapter was on Yogi Adityanath. And the reason was I wanted to introduce Westerners to how India is different from a Western country. That is, one of the major points of the book is that Indian democracy is the same democracy as Western liberal democracy. But the Indian electorate is a very different electorate from the Western electorate. That is, the Indian electorate is highly conservative, highly religious, highly nationalistic. They pray every day. When you ask Indians, should you respect your parents? 98% say it's important to respect your parents. If you ask that question in the US, you would get 20%. So India is a very different electorate from the US or Australia or Canada. And I wanted to make that clear. And so I started with the chapter on Yogi Adityanath. If I were instead to have started with a chapter about Narendra Modi, I would say nothing special about that. Modi started in a very modest way, was hardworking, was highly religious, and he rose to become his country's prime minister. That could happen in America. That could happen in Australia. Yogi Adityanath could not happen in America, right? He is distinctively Indian, and his story could not happen in any democratic country except India. And that's why I wanted to use this as being emblematic. I wanted to introduce Americans to the idea of Uttar Pradesh, that here is a state that most Americans have never heard of, but it has a population over 200 million. It has a chief minister who's literally a monk, and the head of, not figuratively, he's not just religious, he's the head of a major religious order.
Yeah.
That has a population where it has a population with problems like and I'm going to talk about this, I know it's very distressing, but if a 16-year-old girl is raped, that she might feel ashamed and marry the man who raped her to prevent shame to herself and her family. That doesn't happen in America, right? So why does Uttar Pradesh need a law to prevent forced religious conversion? Because to American ears, it sounds like, oh, he's repressing freedom of religion by trying to prevent conversions. It's like, no. In the Indian context, in the Uttar Pradesh context, you need the law because you can't have a situation where a girl is raped and then joins the religion because she doesn't want to, because she'll be shunned by her own family and her, in America, she would prosecute the rapist. Right? So it's a very different environment. And so I wanted Americans to get that idea of, no, when we're asking how democracy operates, democracy, which means, the ability to vote for the things you want, the ability to eject your leaders from office if they don't deliver, the ability to speak freely on things, all the things we associate with democracy will produce very different outcomes in India. And specifically in a very poor state like Uttar Pradesh, than it produces in California or Florida or New York. And so the Yogi, and I had the chapter is called The Minister Monk, and it focuses on Yogi Adityanath's governance in Uttar Pradesh to point out that Yogi Adityanath governs in a democratic way with accountability and transparency in a state that is a population with an income level that is 1/50th the average income level in the United States. Now, Yogi Adityanath also does things I disapprove of. I'm very clear in the chapter that I do think Yogi Adityanath makes many Islamophobic comments at election time. I certainly don't endorse the extrajudicial use of bulldozers to bulldoze homes of criminals. There are lots of things I don't agree with about Yogi Adityanath. I'm not endorsing him as a politician. I'm using him to explain that whatever you agree or disagree with him, he's the result of democracy in action in a proper liberal democracy with a different electorate. This is not California. This is Uttar Pradesh.
Okay, then you have a chapter which has a lot of Swami Vivekananda.
Yes. Very much. Look, I started this book with Vivekananda. I started my study of Indian nationhood with Vivekananda. I think he is the great, the towering figure of the creation of the Indian nation, not just of Hindu identity or Hindu reform, but of Indianness. And his message to Indians was first that you're all one people. And remember, that may sound perfectly normal now. Of course, all Indians are one people. In 1898, it was not clear that a Bengali Muslim, and a Sikh from Punjab, and a Hindu from Delhi, and a Kashmiri Pandit, and it was not clear, a Tamil, it was not clear that they were all one people. His message was all Indians were one people, and that the world needed India. It needed the inspiration of India to learn how to live together. And he repeatedly cites the Bhagavad Gita, saying that all paths ultimately run to Krishna. And he cites the prayer to Shiva, saying that all rivers ultimately flow from Shiva, if you trace them up. That is, he says that no matter what your religion, no matter what your faith, ultimately you belong to this same community. And that creation of a nationhood, I think, was the crucial step in the creation of the Indian national identity, which supported Indian democracy. And crucially, he included people, and the chapter is titled "Not Only Tolerance."
Not only toleration.
Not only toleration. Karl Popper, the famous Austrian philosopher, said that we can tolerate everything except intolerance. But we can't tolerate
the paradox of tolerance. Yeah.
Paradox of tolerance. Vivekananda said, no, we have to tolerate intolerance. That we can't have a society, where we don't tolerate intolerance. When someone is intolerant, we have to put ourselves in that person's shoes and understand why they're being intolerant. We have to sympathize with our brothers, not merely tolerate our brothers. And although, obviously, most Muslim Indians do not idolize Swami Vivekananda, many Hindu Indians, although they say how wonderful he is, they don't want to follow his prescriptions. It's very difficult to be a saint in our daily lives. But nonetheless, that message that we have to understand the other's position is crucial to making democracy work, especially in such a religiously divided country as India. And I think Vivekananda's message did unite Hindu Indians. Unfortunately, it did not unite Muslim Indians into the same ideas. But I think it's still a prescription for going forward, that India has to move forward. I mean, if I can make it very practical just for a minute, a constant thorn in Hindu-Muslim relations, in intercommunal relations in India, are things like religious processions, where Hindu religious processions may pass in front of a mosque. They have every right to do so. It's a secular state. The road is there for everybody. And the Hindu religious procession has every right, music playing, to march in front of the mosque. But does it have to march in front of the mosque? Or could the Hindu organizers say, we understand that the people at the mosque are sensitive about this. Let's put our procession.
It happens in very different ways, There are a lot of places. In fact, I was myself involved in a law and order situation.
Yes, please tell me.
A law and order situation where that was my first posting as a subdivisional magistrate. And I was confronted with this situation. The mosque came up much after, decades after the procession started. The procession had been taking that route for decades. And then the mosque came up, and then they started objecting. and then they created hell. In fact, I barely escaped injury in that fracas. I had great difficulty controlling it. And look at that. In fact, there were just about there was just one lane, and there was a crowd of about 6,000 Hindus, mostly tribals. I was able to control them with 4 or 5 riflemen with me, and it was very difficult to control these 100 people because they had a lot of arms in that mosque. So, but I am. You can take me as an eyewitness.
Well, but look, I use this as one example. But let's look at the other side of that.
There are hundreds of such examples.
Well, no, let's look at the other side. The Gayan Vapi Mosque in Varanasi is obviously built on top of the Mahadev temple, the Vishwanath temple. It's not an important mosque. It's not the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem where Muhammad ascended to God. It is
there only to humiliate the Hindus.
It's just a neighborhood mosque. It has no. It's virtually unused. Okay.
It used to be virtually unused. After the controversy, now suddenly the fatwa has gone around that people should go there.
My point is that it has no special religious significance for Muslims.
No special religion. Okay. Not even Babri Mosque, for that matter.
Had no special. I know. Same thing. Okay. So again, if we want to learn to think like the other, to sympathize with the other, Muslim leaders have a strong responsibility to say to themselves, I have a right to this mosque, but what does duty tell me? Yes, I have the right to sit in this mosque forever because I'm going to have the court case. We're going to take it to the Supreme Court. The Indian Constitution, or I'm sorry, the Indian law says that every property that was in religious property after the date will remain unchanged. I can sit on this mosque and challenge it in court forever and defend it. But what should I do? I should look to my brother and say, this property is so important to 1 billion people, and it's not important to me. I should negotiate.
In Islamic theology, a non-Muslim cannot be a brother.
Well, there are different interpretations of theology of all. Everyone can have a different interpretation. Look,
no, you cannot have too many different. As far as India is concerned, there is one interpretation. It's called Fatawa Alamgiri.
But everything can change, and this has to change. And the message of the chapter is not just that Hindus have to understand Muslim concerns. It's that in order for Muslims to be fully part of the Indian nation, they have to accept Hindu concerns, right? And look, I'm not the moralist. Swami Vivekananda is the moralist. Hey, I'm the sociologist. Okay. And I'm saying
before we hit the hour, we have to discuss the new establishment which you have talked about in your last chapter.
Look, I'll just finish that thought though. Some solution is necessary because Hindus and Muslims are going to live side by side in India for the next 10,000 years. Muslim Indian leaders have to understand that and accept that and learn to live as brothers with Hindus, just as much as Hindus have to learn to live as brothers with Muslims. If they can't learn that, then the problems will exist for the next 10,000.
I have examples of a few such enlightened Muslim leaders. And there's only one thing common to them. They have been almost excommunicated from their society.
Well, that's something to put. Look, it's a challenge for the future. But yeah, the establishment.
You can ask somebody like Arif Muhammad Khan for that matter.
I am famously a member of the Khan Market gang. I have a great photo on, myself as a member of the Khan Market gang. A lot of the challenges. So I try to explain again. The book's written for a Western audience. And I try to explain to the Western audience that they're constantly hearing, here in Australia, whenever I do an event on India, someone shows up and says, an Indian shows up and says, Salvatore, you're saying India is a democracy, but we Indians know that Narendra Modi is a dictator who's usurped power from the Congress Party, which is the rightful party of government in India, and India has now become an authoritarian state. And the problem for India is that these people are generally highly reputable, English-speaking members that are people who are well accepted in the Australian community, well integrated. Same thing happens in the United States. That is, they're members of the old establishment. And I often use the example: if there's a cocktail party in Manhattan, could I run into Rahul Gandhi at a cocktail party in Manhattan? Sure. Could I run into Priyanka Gandhi at a cocktail party in Manhattan? Sure. Could I run into Mohan Bhagwat at a cocktail party in Manhattan?
No way.
There's no way this could possibly happen, right? And that's, in a nutshell, that's the idea. That's the point, is that there's an old establishment in India that is internationally connected. They are still the voice of India.
It's on the cocktail circuit.
On the cocktail circuit. If I'm an editor at the New York Times or a professor at Harvard, what kind of Indian am I likely to meet? I'm likely to meet an Indian of the old establishment. That's slowly changing because there's a new establishment in India. The new establishment has not repressed the old establishment. It's simply become more important. So there's the con market. I love the con market. When I went to India, it was the first place I went. I went to Bari Sons booksellers in the con market, and I bought a stack of English language books, right? Con market. But if you go out to Noida and you see the new shopping centers, they do 20 times the business of the con market. Right? New India. So the con market's still there. No one's burned it to the ground. The old establishment is still there. They're just less and less meaningfully important. Right? So if you think of your audience in India versus, let's say, Karan Thapar, he's an icon of the old establishment. Your audience is magnitudes larger. He's still there. I mean, no one has taken away his voice. He still has a platform. He's still, he's still there. The old establishment still exists. It's just been supplanted by a much larger, much more broad-based, and increasingly much richer new establishment. And that's caused a lot of the friction that Westerners see, and we hear in the West. Oh, these uncouth Hindu right-wingers have taken over India. And my answer to that is, well, that's democracy. I mean, I'm not Hindu. I'm not a right-winger. I don't endorse Yogi Adityanath's policies. I'm not a Narendra Modi supporter. I'm just someone who looks at this and says, no, I know what's happening here. What's happening here is people are losing power who really are upset that they're losing power.
Quite right.
Well, that's what happens.
That's about sums it up. So when is your book coming out?
Well, it's already out globally since May 15th, but the Indian edition will come out in December. So right now it's only available in India as an import at a very high price, but there will be a moderately priced Indian edition.
I saw that. I think it's more than 2,000 rupees.
Yeah. But we'll get the Indian edition in December. Look, the publishers want to make their money globally. They didn't want everyone buying the Indian edition and selling it in America. So they want to make their money. Anyone listening to this outside India, please buy the global edition. The publishers have been very supportive, and you can afford $30 for the book. Anyone who's in India, please be patient. We'll get the Indian edition to you as soon as we can.
So congratulations once again, Salvatore.
Thank you very much.
We hope your book is a raging success. And thank you for coming over to the Jaipur Dialogues and sharing your thoughts about the book. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.